Welcome to the Bookle channel. Do not forget to like the video and press the subscribe button. Let's follow the fifth secret from the book, The Ultimate Secrets of Total Self-Confidence. Secret number 5. I'm not guilty. You're not guilty. Guilt is one of the most common forms of stress in our society. The world is full of guilt-ridden people. Unless you are one of those rare individuals who have overcome this destructive emotion, you probably share a variety of unnecessary guilt feelings with the vast majority. Most of us have been conditioned to feel guilty. Family, friends, society, school, loved ones, and religion have consciously or unconsciously turned us into guilt machines. We have been reminded since childhood of our so-called bad behavior and made to feel guilty about things we did or didn't do, or said or didn't say. Since most of us are conditioned to seek approval from others, we cannot handle guilt when it is imposed upon us from an outside source. Guilt is the master tool of the manipulator. All a person has to do is to make us feel guilty, and we feel compelled to get back into their good graces as soon as possible. Most people can be manipulated into doing just about anything if they can be made to feel guilty enough. Why do we permit this to happen? Simply because guilt has been associated with caring, and if you don't care, you are a bad person. The truth is that guilt has nothing whatsoever to do with caring. Rather, it is a manifestation of neurotic behavior which, oddly enough, is accepted as normal by most people. In other words, to show that you really care, you are expected to feel guilty. If you don't, then you don't really care. This twisted line of reasoning controls the lives of a tragic number of individuals. It is interesting to note that, in my classes, when I say one must never feel guilty, someone invariably raises his hand and asks, "Do you mean that I shouldn't ever feel guilty about anything?" Of course, what he is trying to say is that he has been so conditioned into feeling guilty that he feels guilty about not feeling guilty. A look at morality. A great many actions that are labeled good or bad by certain individuals, society, or religious groups are nothing more than moral value of judgments based on their present levels of awareness, which may be faulty. What is moral and right for you today may not be moral and right for you tomorrow, at another time, or in another place. For morality varies from place to place and time to time. Thomas More put it very well when he said, "I find the doctors and the sages have differed in all climes and ages, and 2 in 50 scarce agree on what is pure morality." Laws that are based on morality are not universal laws, for universal laws are immutable. They are few, simple, and enforceable everywhere, always, automatically, without interference or moral value judgment by any group, religion, or individual. There is no universal law to support guilt. Remember, guilt is a learned emotional response. The 7 major forms of guilt. Parent a child guilt. As a child, you were made to feel guilty by the adults around you and by your family in particular. After all, if they felt guilty, it was good enough for them, so it must be enough good for you too. If they didn't like what you did or said, you were told that you were a bad girl or a bad boy. A value judgment was placed on you instead of your actions. Throughout your growing years, especially the first 5 years, you were conditioned to respond to good and bad, right and wrong. Guilt was enforced through the reward and punishment system. It was at this time that you began to identify with your actions. Parents unwittingly use guilt as a means of controlling their children. They tell a child that, if he doesn't do a certain thing, he will make them unhappy. Their weapons are phrases like, "What will the neighbors think? You embarrassed us. You disappointed us. Where are your manners?" And the list goes on and on. Whenever you failed to please your parents, it was time for them to play the guilt game. As a result, you developed a behavior pattern of pleasing others first to avoid feeling guilty. You said what people wanted you to say and did what they wanted you to do. You were conditioned to believe that, by conforming, you would please others. And so you developed the never-ending need to make a good impression. Child-parent guilt. In a reversal of the parent-or-child guilt game, children frequently use guilt to manipulate their parents. Most parents want to be viewed as good parents and cannot cope with the feeling that their child thinks they don't love them. To coerce them, the child uses statements like, "You really don't love me," or "so," and so's parents let him do it. The child also reminds them of the things they did or didn't do. Things the child intuitively knows will produce guilt feelings. This behavior was learned by watching adults. The child doesn't know exactly how it works, only that it is most effective in getting what he wants. Since manipulation is the main concern in childhood, it doesn't take long for the child to catch on. As you have previously learned, guilt is a learned emotional response. It is not natural behavior in a child. If your child is trying to manipulate you through guilt, you can be sure he picked up the tactics from a good teacher. Guilt through love. "If you loved me" are some of the most guilt-producing words used in a love relationship to manipulate the other partner. When we say, "If you loved me, you would do this," we are really saying, "Feel guilty if you don't do it." Or if you refuse, "You really don't care about me." Since we have been conditioned that we must show that we care, we are easily manipulated by these guilt phrases, and if these phrases don't work, we can always resort to other tactics such as the silent treatment, refusal of sex, hurt feelings, anger, tears or tantrums. Another tactic is to use guilt to punish our partners for behaviors that we feel are inconsistent with our values and beliefs. We bring up past transgressions and remind them of how wrong they were and how they disappointed us and let us down. As long as we can keep this guilt game going, we can manipulate them into doing what we want. When they do not live up to our beliefs, expectations, and values, we use guilt to set them right. These are but a few of the ways we use guilt in a love relationship. Society-inspired guilt. This starts in school when you fail to please your teacher. You are made to feel guilty about your behavior by being told that you could have done better or that you have let your teacher down. Without getting to the root of the problem or the student's faulty awareness, of teacher-inspired guilt makes less work for the teacher and is an effective means of control. Our prison system is an excellent example of the guilt theory in action. If you go against society's moral code, you are punished by confinement in an institution. During this time, you are supposed to feel guilty for what you have done. The worse the crime, the longer you have to feel guilty. You are then released without the real problem, your faulty awareness, specifically your poor self-esteem, being corrected. The end result is that most prisoners end up back in prison after committing another crime. Guilt feelings over social behavior condition you to worry about what others say or think of your actions. This is why etiquette is so strongly adhered to. To most people, it is a life and death matter which side of the plate to place the fork. We have become so concerned about other people's opinions or being politically correct that we have to monitor everything we say and do so that we don't offend anyone. Sexual guilt. Most people experience sexual guilt. The root cause of sexual guilt is religion. Religion has decided what forms of sexual expression are good or bad, natural or sinful. These moral value judgments have been passed on from generation to generation like a contagious disease. If your value system included any form of sexual expression that was considered morally unacceptable, you were made to feel guilty and shameful. Things like masturbation, premarital sex, pornography, homosexuality, abortion and the like were all bad and sinful. The result is that most people have a variety of sexual hang-ups and repressed feelings of guilt, conditioned since childhood on the evils of sex. It is impossible for the average person to enjoy certain forms of sexual pleasure without a sense of guilt. This will not change until we learn this valuable and basic lesson. There is no need to feel guilty about any form of sexual expression, which is within one's own value system and does not physically harm another person. More importantly, it is neither right or wrong regardless of what other people say or think. Keep in mind that guilt is nothing more than a value judgment placed upon us by an outside authority figure. Religious guilt. Religion has done more than its share to develop and instill deep-seated guilt feelings. Indeed, it may well take credit for the original sin of guilt, as guilt is the means by which religion keeps its followers in line through the mistaken interpretation of perfection. Many religious denominations instill guilt in those who do not meet their moral value judgments based on their interpretation of the scriptures. They start with the premise that all judgment is based on perfection. Perfection, they say, is good, imperfection bad. This mistaken interpretation of perfection has limited comprehension of the word's true meaning. If you put 10,000 of the same objects under a microscope, you would see that no two are exactly alike. It is a biological, physiological, psychological, and metaphysical fact that each entity is distinctly different. Each individual is an expression of creative intelligence. Perfection, and everything else for that matter, is relative. Wallace Stevens put it this way: 20 men crossing a bridge into a village are 20 men crossing 20 bridges into 20 villages. Some religions, by expecting people to perceive God, truth, and the scriptures in the same way, have doomed their followers to failure. Paradoxically, to be perfect, you must have some flaws. Imperfections are the means by which you learn to grow and by which humankind is spurred on to create. To have no imperfections is to have no need to develop mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. This means we must allow ourselves the freedom to grow mentally, emotionally, and spiritually untainted by guilt. It is difficult for someone who has been programmed into believing that all sin is bad to see value and, yes, even beauty in sin and error. Religion says that sin is bad, yet few clergymen would deny that we learn from our mistakes. The difference may well be whether or not we learn the particular lesson they wish to teach us. Some of the world's outstanding achievements have come from individuals whose imperfections spurred them on to creative effort. If you read the biography of any great man or woman who has made a significant end to humankind, you will see, almost without exception, a person with flaws, many of which society has labeled sinful. Being aware of this should enable you to put your own guilt into perspective. Guilt is unnecessary and self-destructive. Having the desire to overcome so-called imperfections, sins, and mistakes is sufficient. Self-imposed guilt. The most destructive form of guilt is that which is self-imposed. This is guilt we impose on ourselves when we feel that we have broken our own moral code or the moral code of society. It originates when we look at our past behavior and see that we have made an unwise choice or action. We examine what we did, whether it was criticizing others, stealing, cheating, lying, exaggerating, breaking religious rules, or committing any other act we feel is wrong in the light of our present value system. In most cases, the guilt we feel is an attempt to show that we care and are sorry for our actions. Essentially, what we are doing is whipping ourselves for what we did and attempting to change history. What we fail to realize is that the past cannot be changed. There is a world of difference between feeling guilty and learning from the past. Going through a self-inflicted guilt sentence is a neurotic trip you must stop if you want to develop total self-confidence. Feeling guilty does not build self-confidence. It will only keep you a prisoner of the past and immobilize you in the present. By harboring guilt, you are escaping the responsibility of living in the present and moving toward the future. Guilt always brings punishment. Guilt always brings punishment. The punishment may take many forms, including depression, feelings of inadequacy, lack of self-confidence, poor self-esteem, an assortment of physical disorders, and the inability to love ourselves and others. Those who cannot forgive others and hold resentment in their hearts are the same people who have never learned to forgive themselves. They are the guilt-ridden people. Trying to ignore your mistakes is just as damaging as holding on to the guilt they have caused you. Mistakes should be treated like a speck of dust in the eye. As soon as you identify the problem, don't condemn yourself or feel guilty for having it. Just get rid of it. The sooner you do, the sooner you will be free from the pain it is causing you. Only then will you be able to live a creative life, build self-confidence, and express your unlimited potential. Learning from the past. Learning from past behavior is important to developing total self-confidence. But feeling guilty about what you have done is not learning from the past. Learning from the past means recognizing mistakes and resolving, to the best of your ability and awareness, not to repeat them. Mentally whipping yourself over what you have done or wasting valuable time and energy on feeling guilty, shameful, or unworthy is not part of this lesson. Such negative emotions only prevent you from changing your present life experience because your dominant attention is focused on the past. Nobody can live in the past and function creatively in the present. Your mind cannot cope with two realities at the same time. Your life reflects whatever occupies your dominant attention. If you are giving your dominant attention to what you have or should have said and done, the present will be one of frustration, anxiety, and confusion. This is too high of a price to pay. It is far better to forgive yourself and, with a positive attitude, move on toward the future. Remember, you always do your best. You always do your best. Mark it well, and don't forget it. Every decision you make and every action you take is based on your level of awareness at that moment. You can never be better than your present level of awareness, for it is the clarity with which you perceive any situation. If your awareness is faulty, you will have a faulty experience, which may cause you to do or say things you will regret later on, because your awareness is always fixed at a certain level. Whatever you do or don't do, whatever you say or don't say, is your best, even if your best is faulty or unwise. The simple fact is that you had only one choice, and that was governed by your awareness at that moment. You are not your actions. Your actions are only the means you use to fulfill your dominant needs. They may be wise or unwise, but this does not classify you as good or bad. At the very source of your being, you are a spiritually perfect individual who, for the moment, may be acting upon a faulty awareness. The scriptures state clearly that you are made in the image and likeness of God. If this is true, then you must already be perfect, but are prevented from this realization by your existing awareness. The more you accept this truth, the more you will be able to express that perfection. It helps to remember that God doesn't turn out faulty products. Make a guilt diary. Here is a personal experiment you will find interesting and helpful. For the next 21 days, keep a guilt diary. Observe yourself in action for this 3-week period. Make notes and record all the details. 1. Every time you try to make someone else feel guilty. 2. Every time someone tries to make you feel guilty. 3. Every time you try to make yourself feel guilty. By doing this, you will become acutely aware of how much time is spent playing the guilt game. Every time you try to make yourself or someone else feel guilty, stop right then and there and make a correction. This will change your habit patterns, and soon you will cease playing the game altogether. Every time you sense someone is trying to make you feel guilty, then let them know that their game is no longer effective. The victim must let the exploiter know that he or she is no longer vulnerable. At first they won't believe you because they have been using guilt to manipulate you for so long. But once they realize that you no longer need their approval and will not play the guilt game, they will cease using guilt as a means to exploit you.